A classroom. The year is 1930. 27 students, full of life, promise, and the simple dreams of childhood. They gathered every morning in a small, remote schoolhouse, a place of learning and friendship, nestled in the quiet, rolling hills of a small community. For months, their days unfolded in a predictable rhythm of lessons and laughter. But one day, the rhythm broke. The final bell rang, the doors closed, and as the students bundled up to head home, someone was missing. Just one, out of 27, and what happened next wasn't a runaway or a prank. It was a mystery so dark, so enduring, it would echo through the decades. A cold case that would haunt a town and an entire nation. This isn't just a story about a missing child. It's about a secret kept by the very walls of that old school, a shadow that fell over an innocent classroom, and the chilling question that remains. What really happened to the 26 who went home? If you're as captivated by history's unsolved puzzles as I am, you're in the right place. Before we dive into this chilling story, please take a moment to hit that like button. It helps this channel reach more people who love documentaries like this, and if you want to join our community of history detectives and never miss a new mystery, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, let's get into it. Sometimes, the greatest tragedies don't happen in the dark and the shadows. They happen under the bright, blue sky, in a place that feels as safe as your own front porch. That's where our story begins. In a place so small, it didn't even have a name on most maps. It was just a smattering of farmhouses, a general store that smelled of cinnamon and dry goods, and a church with a steeple that seemed to stand guard over the entire community. The year was 1930. The world was teetering, on the edge of the Great Depression, but here, life moved at a different pace. It was a rhythm set by the seasons: the spring planting, the summer harvest, the quiet, crisp fall days leading into winter. This was a place where everyone knew everyone, not just by name, but by their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. A place where a neighbor would lend you a hand with no questions asked. And a barn raising was a community-wide celebration, and at the heart of this community, both literally and figuratively, was the schoolhouse. It wasn't some grand brick building. It was a simple, one-room wooden structure, painted a cheerful white with a bell tower that looked like a little hat perched on top. To the children who walked to its doors, it was more than just a place to learn their ABCs. It was the center of their social universe. They played tag in the dusty yard, shared lunches from tin pails, and learned everything from arithmetic to geography from a single, dedicated teacher. The class was small, a tight-knit group of just 27 students, ranging in age from first grade all the way up to 8th. They were like a big family, with the older kids looking out for the younger ones, and everyone knowing exactly where they belonged. But as we all know, even the most perfect picture can have a crack in it. And this picture was about to shatter, leaving behind a cold mystery that still echoes today. Life in the one-room schoolhouse was a constant hum of activity. The younger students would sit at the front, their small hands tracing letters on chalkboards, while the older kids worked on more advanced lessons in the back. The air was often thick with the smell of wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove in the corner, and the scratching of pen on paper. The teacher, a woman known for her kindness and unwavering dedication, was the heart of it all, guiding this diverse group of minds through their education. This wasn't just a school. It was a microcosm of the entire community. A place where the children of farmers, laborers, and tradesmen all sat side by side, learning the same lessons and sharing the same future. The schoolhouse itself was an unassuming building, a sentinel on a small rise surrounded by open fields and a thick belt of woods. A simple gravel path led to the front door, worn smooth by countless little footsteps over the years. On any given day, you could hear the joyful shouts of the children during recess, the soft ringing of the school bell, and the murmur of lessons spilling out into the quiet air. The students themselves were a typical bunch for the time, dressed in simple, practical clothes, their faces rosy from the fresh country air. They were children of a simpler era, where a good day was defined by a successful game of marbles or a perfectly recited poem. They had no idea that their innocence was about to be stolen, and that their little school would be transformed from a symbol of learning into a monument to a mystery that would defy logic and leave a permanent scar on their lives. The school year had been proceeding, as it always did, a tapestry of routines and rituals that made up the fabric of daily life. The morning bell, the Pledge of Allegiance, the rustle of textbooks, and the shared snacks at lunchtime. Every day 27 children would arrive, and every day children would leave. There was a comfort in this predictability, a sense of security that comes from a small, unchanging world. But as we know, predictability can be a fragile thing. A single, unexpected event can tear a hole in that fabric, and the world can come crashing down. On this particular morning, a day in late October, there was nothing to suggest the tragedy to come. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. The students arrived just as they always did, their voices and laughter echoing across the fields. They were all there, the quiet ones who loved to read, the boisterous ones who couldn't wait for recess, the older students who helped the teacher with the younger children. The teacher, as always, meticulously took attendance. Names, 27 young faces looking back at her. No one could have known that this perfect count, this simple act of confirming everyone was present, would become the last moment of true normalcy for this school, this community, and for of those students. The bell rang, the lessons began, and the world seemed to be in perfect order. But somewhere, a clock was ticking down to a moment that would change everything forever. Asterisk, as the day wore on, the sun climbed high and then began its slow descent toward the horizon. Recess came and went, with the usual flurry of games and small squabbles. Lunch pails were opened and then snapped shut. Lessons were taught and learned. The gentle hum of the day continued, a steady, unbroken rhythm. But if you were there, if you could look back with the knowledge of what was to come, you might notice something. A tiny detail, a moment that seemed insignificant then, but would later be picked apart by investigators and grieving families. For decades, was there a look exchanged? A whispered word? Or was it all just a trick of memory, a way for the mind to try and find a reason where there was none? As the afternoon light slanted through the schoolhouse windows, the final bell rang. It was a familiar sound, a signal for freedom and the promise of home. Pencils were put away, books were stacked, and 27 children, bundled in coats and scarves, began to gather their things. The classroom buzzed with the happy energy of a day's end. The door opened, and one by one, two by two, they stepped out into the chilly air. The teacher stood by the door, waving goodbye and watching, as they all started down their separate paths toward home. But as the last child disappeared from view, something was wrong. The silence that fell over the schoolyard wasn't just the quiet of an empty classroom. It was the silence of a missing heartbeat. A crucial, painful realization began to dawn. 27 students had arrived that morning, but as the teacher went back inside to tidy up, she knew. She knew with a cold, sinking certainty that only 26 had gone home, and the shadow of that missing child would forever fall over the one-side Alex schoolhouse, turning a place of learning into a place of unending questions. Asterisk. The first moments of a nightmare rarely feel like a nightmare at all. They often feel like a simple mistake, an easy mix-up. That's how it began for the teacher. As she tidied up the now-sealant classroom, a nagging feeling settled in her gut. She had counted 27 students in the morning, and her final tally was 26. Maybe one of the older boys had stayed behind to help her with the chores, or perhaps one of the children was just playing a prank, hiding in the cloakroom. Her mind, desperate for a logical explanation, raced through the possibilities. But a quick check of the small building confirmed her worst fear. The schoolhouse was empty. The initial confusion quickly gave way to a cold dread. She retraced her steps, looking for a forgotten mitten or a lunch pail left behind. Anything to point to a student who might have doubled back. There was nothing. With a growing sense of panic, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside, her eyes scanning the now empty path. The last student had been gone for almost 20 minutes. 20 minutes was a long time for a small child to be alone on a country road. She called out a name, then another, her voice swallowed by the vast, quiet fields. But there was no reply. The day's cheerful sounds had been replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. This was no ordinary disappearance. There were no strangers passing through town, no reports of suspicious vehicles. The teacher knew every family, every child. These were children who didn't wander far, who knew the dangers of the woods, and who were taught to go straight home. But now, one of them was gone. The simple act of a child not going home for supper was about to set off a chain reaction of fear, suspicion, and a frantic search that would change this quiet town forever. The name of the missing child, the one whose desk sat empty, and whose laughter was now a haunting memory, was about to become a whispered legend. As twilight began to paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, the truth slowly became undeniable. The first call went out to the parents. The teacher, her voice trembling, explained that their child hadn't returned home. A phone tree, the old-fashioned kind where one call led to the next, was set into motion. The initial reaction was a mixture of disbelief and frantic energy. The mother, assuming her child had simply gone to a friend's house, started calling neighbors. The father, a practical man, grabbed a lantern and began walking the path from the school, expecting to find the child playing, or perhaps with a sprained ankle. But as they all realized, no one had seen the child since school had let out. Growing panic was a physical thing. It spread through the community like a cold draft on a winter night. Soon neighbors were gathering at the schoolhouse, their faces etched with worry in the flickering lantern light. The child's name was whispered again and again, the name that, from this point forward, would be forever linked to the mystery of the empty desk. The missing student was 10-year-old Sarah Miller. By all accounts, Sarah was a bright, lively girl who loved to draw and had a laugh that could fill a room. She was one of the older students, responsible and mature for her age. The idea that she would simply wander off was unthinkable. She was known to be a careful and obedient child, trusted by her parents to make the walk to and from school without issue. But on this day, the usual path home had not led to her front door. It had simply ended. The full weight of the situation, hit everyone with a chilling finality. A child had vanished from a place where children were supposed to be safe, in a town where strangers were non-existent. The small community was about to learn that sometimes the greatest dangers aren't far away, but hidden in plain sight, and that a small, quiet town can hold a darkness as deep as any city. The evening quickly devolved into a frantic, unorganized search. A group of men, armed with lanterns and a desperate kind of hope, fanned out across the fields and along the tree line of the nearby woods. They called Sarah's name, their shouts echoing in the chilly night air. The women, meanwhile, gathered at the Miller home, trying to offer comfort, making endless pots of coffee, and fielding the calls that came in, each one a new dead end. The entire community was swept up in the unfolding tragedy, a collective nightmare no one could wake up from. As the hours passed and the night grew colder, hope began to fade. The search party found no sign of Sarah, no torn piece of clothing, no scuffed shoe, no sign of a struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The family dog, a loyal collie who always met Sarah on her way home, had been waiting by the front door since before sunset, whining and restless, a silent witness to a journey that had never been completed. Her friends and classmates were questioned, but their stories were all the same. Sarah had been fine. She had said her goodbyes like everyone else, and had started walking home. The police were called, but in a small town in 1930, resources were scarce. The local sheriff, a man who dealt with little more than stray livestock and petty disputes, was ill-equipped to handle a case of this magnitude. He arrived at the schoolhouse, taking notes on a small pad, his face a grim mask of disbelief. He questioned the teacher again, walked the path himself, and spoke to the children's parents, but it was all just going through the motions. The only real clue was the silence itself, the profound, terrifying fact that there was no trail to follow, no witness to question, and no logical reason for a 10-year-old girl to disappear on her short walk home. The night stretched on, a long, agonizing blur of cold air and growing despair. The search party grew, as more people from neighboring farms and even a few from the next town over joined in. They moved through the fields in a silent line, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. They were looking for a lost child, but what they were really searching for was a shred of hope, any sign that Sarah was just hiding, or had maybe gotten lost in the thick woods that lined the property. But as the hours bled into one another, and the moon rose high in the sky, they found nothing. Sarah Miller's parents, a stoic and hard-working couple, were now just two figures consumed by grief and confusion. Their home, usually a place of warmth and family, felt cold and hollow. They sat by the phone, listening for a ring that never came. Their minds replaying the last time they had seen their daughter that morning. They tried to remember every detail, every word, searching for a clue they might have missed. But there was no clue to be found. The story was simple and devastating in its simplicity. A girl went to school and never came home. The schoolhouse, once a beacon of community, now stood as a silent witness to a great loss. The classroom, which had been so full of life just hours before, now felt haunted. Sarah's desk sat empty, a stark reminder of the void she had left behind. The other students, who had all gone home to the warmth of their families, were now burdened with a new kind of fear, a fear that had never existed in their small, safe world. They had gone to school with 27 friends, and came home with only 86, a simple number, but a monumental loss. And as the dawn broke over the quiet community, it did not bring with it the light of answers, but only the cold reality of an unsolvable mystery. Dawn arrived, but it brought no comfort. The first light of day revealed a grim and somber scene. What had been a frantic, chaotic search in the dark was now a grim, methodical operation. The entire community was out, their faces pale and drawn from a sleepless night. Farmers, their fields forgotten for the day, walked shoulder to shoulder in a grid pattern across the open land, their eyes scanning every inch of ground. The silence that had descended with night was now replaced by the quiet, purposeful movements of people united by a single, terrifying goal: to find Sarah Miller. The search centered on the most logical places. They started by meticulously retracing the path from the schoolhouse to the Miller's farm, a walk Sarah had made hundreds of times. They looked in ditches, behind bushes, and under every fallen log. The woods, which in daylight seemed less ominous than they had at night, were thoroughly combed, but they found nothing. Not a ribbon, not a discarded book, not a single clue. It was as if the ground itself had swallowed her whole. The fact that there was no physical evidence, no sign of a struggle, no dropped item was perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. It suggested not a tragic accident, but something more deliberate, more sinister. The local sheriff, now completely overwhelmed, reluctantly reached out for help. A few state troopers were dispatched, their presence a stark reminder that this was no longer just a small-town problem. They arrived with a degree of professionalism and equipment the local community lacked, but even they were baffled. They questioned the parents again, the teacher again, and even the other students. But every conversation led to the same dead end. Sarah had been there, and then she wasn't. The very simplicity of the disappearance was its most maddening and terrifying aspect. How could a 10-year-old girl vanish in broad daylight, surrounded by her friends, in a place where everyone knew everyone? The question hung in the air, a chilling weight on the entire town. Asterisk, as the days turned into a week, the community's hope began to curdle into something sour and bitter. The initial, unified effort started to show cracks. Whispers began to circulate. Some pointed fingers at the quiet new family who had moved to the edge of town months ago. Others, steeped in local lore, spoke of the old, abandoned well at the edge of the woods, a place children were forbidden to go. The community, once a pillar of strength, was now a tinderbox of suspicion and fear. Every stranger's car that drove through town became a source of intense scrutiny, and every neighbor with an unusual habit became a potential suspect. The search continued, but the numbers dwindled. The initial frenzy gave way to a weary, grim determination. The search parties, now smaller, were no longer shouting Sarah's name with a sense of desperate hope, but rather with a quiet, hollow sadness. They were no longer looking for a lost girl. They were looking for a body. This shift in mindset was perhaps the most painful part of the entire ordeal. The Miller family's farm became a hub of activity, but it was a somber, silent one. People brought food, offered condolences, and tried to help in any way they could, but no one knew what to say. How do you comfort a parent whose child has simply ceased to exist? The state troopers, after days of fruitless searching, packed up their gear. They left behind a few local deputies and a promise to follow up on any new leads. But what leads were there? The case was as cold as the autumn air. The schoolhouse, which had been the center of the search, now stood as a silent, painful monument. The other children, Sarah's friends, went back to school, but the rhythm was broken. They would cast nervous glances at Sarah's empty desk, and the quiet fear in their hearts was now a permanent guest. The innocence of the community had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by a haunting question that had no answer. The search for Sarah Miller was a testament to the unyielding spirit of a small town, but it was also a harrowing lesson in futility. The local sheriff, now completely out of his depth, found himself caught between the desperate pleas of the Miller family and the rising tide of fear among the townsfolk. He organized a more official, wider search party, bringing in a few more volunteers from neighboring towns. They spread out further, looking in the shallow river that wound its way through the valley, checking abandoned barns and sheds, and even venturing deeper into the thick, imposing forest that everyone had always known to avoid. As the search wore on, the details of the day Sarah vanished became the focus of intense scrutiny. The other students, her classmates, were questioned again and again. Their memories, once so clear, were now clouded by fear and the passage of time. They remembered saying goodbye to Sarah, but did anyone see her start down the path? Was she alone? Had she been walking with a friend? The answers were frustratingly inconsistent. Some recalled her walking with a few of the other girls for a short while before they split off. Others thought she had been by herself from the moment she left the schoolhouse door. These small, contradictory details, once dismissed as childhood confusion, now took on monumental importance. The children, once witnesses, now became a source of both hope and frustration. The teacher, too, was re-interviewed countless times. She was asked to describe Sarah's demeanor on that final day. Was she sad? Was she quiet? Had she received a note? The teacher, however, insisted Sarah was her usual cheerful self. She was a typical 10-year-old girl, excited for the end of the school day. This lack of a clear motive, or any pre-existing problem, only deepened the mystery. The town was left to wonder. If there was no reason for Sarah to run away, then what reason was there for her to disappear? The search continued, but with each passing day, it felt less like a search and more like a vigil. Asterisk, as the search efforts reached their peak and then began to wane, the community was left to grapple with an unbearable reality. The initial hope that Sarah would be found, cold and scared but alive, was now a distant memory. The search parties, now just a handful of dedicated volunteers, continued to walk the land, but their footsteps were heavy with a sense of finality. The Miller family, once full of a vibrant, resilient spirit, was now broken. Their daily routine of waking up with the sun to work the land was replaced with the agonizing wait for news that would never come. Every creak of the front gate, every passing car, was a cruel, momentary flicker of hope that was immediately extinguished. The schoolhouse, which had been the heart of the community, was now a painful symbol of its deepest wound. The students who returned to their desks were no longer just children. They were survivors of an unexplained tragedy, a silent group of witnesses to a disappearance that haunted their every lesson. The teacher, who had once found joy in their youthful energy, now saw their nervous glances and whispered questions. She would look at Sarah's empty chair and feel a guilt that would never leave her. Could she have done something differently? Noticed a strange car? Paid more attention to a detail that seemed trivial at the time? These were the questions that would plague her for the rest of her life. The search for Sarah Miller didn't just end with a final announcement, or a grand declaration. It simply faded away, like a fire running out of fuel. The last volunteer went home, the final state trooper left town, and the posters with Sarah's picture, once bright and hopeful, began to fade in the sun and rain. The case officially went cold, but for the town, the mystery was still very much alive. The story of the 27 students who went to school, and the one who never came home became a permanent part of the town's folklore. A cautionary tale whispered from generation to generation. The search had found nothing, but it had uncovered a fear that would forever change the way this small community looked at itself and its neighbors. When a tragedy strikes a small town, people's minds tend to turn inward, looking for a familiar face to blame. The idyllic image of the community began to unravel, replaced by a deep-seated paranoia. The sheriff, desperate for a lead, started looking not for a stranger, but for a known quantity, someone who, for one reason or another, might have harbored a dark secret. He began with the most obvious suspects, the people who were closest to the scene and had the most opportunity. The first person to fall under suspicion was the schoolteacher herself. On the surface, it seemed unthinkable. She was a respected member of the community, a kind and dedicated educator who had taught generations of children, but in the absence of any other clues, her proximity to the disappearance made her a person of interest. Investigators questioned her tirelessly. They wanted to know about her relationship with Sarah Miller. Was there any conflict? Any punishment that might have caused Sarah to run away? The teacher insisted there was nothing. She recalled Sarah as a bright, happy girl who was doing well in her studies, but the sheriff, under pressure to produce results, continued to press. Was she sure she hadn't had an argument with the girl? Could she have missed something? The teacher's answers were always the same, but the doubt, once planted, began to grow. The very person who had first sounded the alarm was now under a cloud of suspicion. Her once unblemished reputation now tarnished by an unspoken question mark. The other parents, once her closest allies in the search, now looked at her with a new, guarded expression. They didn't voice their suspicions, but the cold glances and whispered conversations were a clear sign that trust had been broken. It was an impossible situation for the teacher. She was grieving for a student she loved, while simultaneously being treated as a potential culprit. This initial line of inquiry led nowhere, but it set a dangerous precedent. The search for a culprit was turning into a hunt for a scapegoat, and in a small town with nowhere to hide, that could be just as devastating as the crime itself. Asterisk with the teacher cleared, the town's suspicion turned elsewhere. The small community, once so trusting, began to scrutinize its own. The quiet man who lived on the edge of the woods, a recluse who kept to himself, became the next target of their fear. He was a veteran of the Great War, and the trauma he carried was often mistaken for malice. He was known for his solitary walks in the forest, and the townsfolk, fueled by gossip and fear, began to imagine him as a sinister figure. The sheriff, desperate for a lead, brought him in for questioning. The interrogation was long and intense. The man was asked about his movements on the day of Sarah's disappearance, about his relationship with the children, and about the contents of his remote cabin. He patiently explained that he had been home all day, working on his small farm, and that he barely knew the children beyond seeing them walk past his property. His story was simple, straightforward, and offered no contradictions. He had no motive, no history of violence, and no connection to Sarah beyond being a distant neighbor. The sheriff, with no evidence to hold him, was forced to let him go, but the damage was done. The man's reputation was forever stained, and he became a pariah in a town that had once merely ignored him. The community's fear hadn't just targeted a potential killer, it had destroyed an innocent man's life. That as the official investigation stalled, a more insidious process began. The whispers turned into accusations, and the town's unity dissolved. Families began to keep their children closer, and the once innocent walks to school were replaced by nervous chaperones. The fear of a stranger was one thing, but the chilling thought that a monster was hiding among them, in plain sight, was something else entirely. The search for a suspect had gone from a methodical investigation to a paranoid witch hunt, and the true culprit, if one existed, was slipping further and further into the shadows. Asterisk. With the initial suspects cleared, the investigation hit a dead end, forcing the sheriff to look at the case from a new angle. What if Sarah Miller's disappearance wasn't a random act, but something deeply personal? He began to turn his attention to the children themselves, the very classmates who were with Sarah on her last day. They were just children, but could one of them have seen something they were too afraid to say? Or, in a truly dark twist, could one of them have been involved? It was a horrifying thought, but in a town with no strangers, a child was the only remaining variable. The sheriff, with the help of the state troopers, began interviewing the students again, but this time, he focused on subtle details and inconsistencies. He asked about friendships, rivalries, and playground disputes. Was there a fight over a toy? A mean comment that was said? He tried to look for the tiny cracks in the seemingly perfect facade of the classroom. The children, already traumatized by Sarah's disappearance, were now subjected to intense questioning. Their parents, who initially supported the police, grew angry and protective. How dare they accuse an innocent child? The community, already divided, fractured even further. What emerged from these interviews was a frustrating mess of childhood gossip and vague recollections. One student remembered a boy having a crush on Sarah, and another mentioned a small argument over a drawing. These were the normal, everyday dramas of a classroom. But under the weight of a missing child, they began to take on a sinister tone. The sheriff had no evidence, no smoking gun, just a jumble of conflicting stories and the emotional turmoil of a group of children who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. The search for a suspect was going in circles, and with each passing day, the hope of finding Sarah alive was slipping away, replaced by the gnawing certainty that the answer lay hidden in the very place she was supposed to be safe. As the investigation stalled and the official suspects were cleared, the case began to take on a life of its own in the town's collective imagination. With no facts to anchor them, people's minds started to drift into the realm of the bizarre and the tragic. Tales of a drifter passing through town on the day of the disappearance began to surface. Stories that had no basis in fact, but were repeated with grim certainty. A few people even whispered about an old, forgotten feud between the Miller family and a distant relative, suggesting that Sarah's disappearance was a twisted act of revenge. These were not leads. They were the desperate, fearful attempts of a community to make sense of something senseless. The sheriff, a practical man who dealt in facts, found himself fighting against a tide of rumors and hearsay. He spent his days chasing down dead ends, interviewing people who had a feeling or a strange dream about what happened. The case was becoming less about finding Sarah Miller and more about managing the town's grief and anger. The absence of a clear suspect and a clear motive was tearing the community apart. The once unified town was now a collection of frightened families, each one holding on to their own version of the truth. The schoolhouse, which had been the center of so much life and activity, now sat under a pall of permanent suspicion. Sarah's empty desk was no longer just a reminder of a missing girl. It was a symbol of the town's shattered innocence. The other students, the 26 who had gone home, were now seen not just as classmates, but as the last people to see Sarah alive. Their young minds, once filled with lessons and laughter, were now burdened with a silence they couldn't break and a mystery they couldn't solve. The official search had ended, the initial suspects had been cleared, but the truth remained hidden, a ghost haunting the fields and the forest, waiting for someone to finally give it a voice. For months, the case of Sarah Miller's disappearance lay cold and dormant. The town, while outwardly moving on, was still silently reeling. The police file, a thin folder filled with dead ends and hearsay, was tucked away, a grim reminder of a failure no one wanted to talk about. Then, just as the first anniversary of Sarah's disappearance loomed, a startling development sent a jolt of electricity through the entire community. A man sitting in a jail cell 100 miles away on an unrelated charge asked to speak to an officer. He had something to get off his chest. He had a confession to make, a confession about the missing schoolgirl from the small town no one had heard of. The man, a transient worker named Thomas Garrity, was no stranger to trouble. He was a drifter, a man with no fixed address, who had been passing through the region around the time Sarah vanished. He told the officers a chilling story. He claimed he had seen Sarah Miller walking home from school. He said he had a moment of impulse, and in a single, terrible act, he took her. He described the location, a remote area deep in the woods, and gave details about the small, rural schoolhouse that a stranger couldn't possibly know. His confession was detailed, disturbing, and felt, to the investigating officers, heartbreakingly real. The news spread like wildfire. The initial reaction was a mixture of relief and fury. Relief that the mystery might finally be solved, and fury at the man who had brought such pain to their community. The Miller family, who had spent a year in a waking nightmare, now had a name too attached to their grief. The sheriff, who had been haunted by the case, felt a surge of validation. He now had an answer for a town that had been demanding one. But as the initial wave of emotion subsided, a few critical questions began to surface. Was the confession too perfect? Was it possible that a man with a history of minor crimes was a ruthless killer? And most importantly, was his story even true? With Garrity's confession in hand, law enforcement moved quickly. They brought him to the location he had described, a heavily wooded area a few miles from the schoolhouse. Garrity led them through the trees to a specific spot, a shallow depression in the ground, partially covered by leaves and brush. He claimed this was where he had buried Sarah's body. The police, their hearts pounding with a mixture of dread and grim determination, began to dig. The world held its breath, waiting for a final, tragic answer. For hours, they searched the area, carefully sifting through the soil, their eyes peeled for any sign of human remains. The Miller family waited at home, their grief now laced with a painful anticipation. The community was on edge, desperate for the closure they had been denied for so long. But as the sun began to set, a different kind of dread began to creep in. They found nothing, no remains, no clothing, not a single bone or button. The ground was just dirt. The officers, baffled and frustrated, questioned Garrity again. He insisted he had the right spot, that he remembered it perfectly. But the lack of physical evidence was a gaping hole in his story. Could he have simply made it up? Was he a fame seeker, a man looking for attention, even if it meant confessing to a heinous crime he didn't commit? Or was it possible that his memory was simply flawed, that he had buried the body in a different, similar-looking location? The police faced a new dilemma. They had a confession, but no body. The case, which for a brief, shining moment seemed to be solved, was now more confusing than ever. The relief the town had felt was replaced by a new, more sinister kind of uncertainty. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just taken on a new, more haunting form. The case against Thomas Garrity quickly unraveled. With no physical evidence, no body, no forensic clues, a confession became the sole pillar of the prosecution's case, and it was a shaky one at best. Investigators went back to him, pressing for more details, asking him to draw a map, to describe the clothes Sarah was wearing, but his memory was inconsistent, his story vague and filled with contradictions. He got the color of the schoolhouse wrong, misremembered the season, and couldn't accurately describe the path she would have taken. He seemed to know just enough about the general area to sound credible, but not enough about the specific details to be a true witness to the crime. It became increasingly clear that Garrity had been fed information. He had likely overheard details about the missing girl while in jail, or read about the case in the local newspaper. He was a man craving attention, and the chance to be the center of a national mystery was too tempting to resist. The idea of him as a vicious killer gave way to the far more pathetic reality of a man desperate for significance. The police were forced to admit that the confession, once seen as the answer, was nothing more than a cruel and elaborate lie. The community, which had briefly experienced a flicker of closure, was now plunged back into a deeper, more profound darkness. The hope that Garrity's confession had offered was now gone, replaced by a painful sense of betrayal. The Miller family, who had been preparing for the sad but necessary task of burying their daughter, now had to reckon with the fact that their nightmare was far from over. The case was once again cold, but it was now tainted by a false lead that had wasted precious time and caused unimaginable emotional distress. The confession, which had promised to put an end to the mystery, had instead created a new one. Why had Thomas Garrity lied? And what did he truly know? The false confession of Thomas Garrity was a devastating blow, not just to the case, but to the collective psyche of the town. The brief hope that had flickered in their hearts was now extinguished, leaving behind a deeper sense of despair. The schoolhouse, which had for a moment been the center of a resolved tragedy, now resumed its role as a silent witness to a great unknown. Sarah Miller's desk remained empty, a grim monument to a mystery that felt more unsolvable than ever before. The community, which had briefly found a common enemy in Garrity, was now fractured again, forced back into a state of paranoid uncertainty. The emotional toll on the Miller family was immeasurable. The year-long grief, which had been put on hold by the promise of closure, returned with a renewed vengeance. They had been told their daughter's story was finally over, only to have that ending snatched away. The memory of her was now intertwined with the cruel lie of a drifter, and the pain was almost too much to bear. They no longer had a suspect, a lead, or even a tangible hope of finding Sarah. The case was back where it started, cold, empty, and full of questions. The police, humiliated by the false lead, were forced to publicly recant the confession. The sheriff, his reputation damaged, returned to the thin file and the old notes, searching for a detail they had missed. But there was nothing new to find. The confession, which had seemed to be a golden key, had been nothing more than a cheap lockpick breaking in their hands and leaving them locked out in the cold. The town was left to wonder, once again, what had happened to Sarah Miller. The case was now even more chilling, burdened not just by an unsolved disappearance, but by the memory of a cruel hoax that had exploited their deepest grief. The haunting confession had not solved the mystery. It had only made the silence that much louder. With the false confession discredited and the official investigation once again a barren landscape. The story of Sarah Miller's disappearance was left to the town itself. The official search may have ended, but the private one had just begun. People, unable to let go of the unanswered question, started to piece together the events of that day from their own memories and perspectives. This is where the story gets murky, where the lines between fact and folklore blur. The true witnesses weren't the police or the Miller family, but the children, the 26 students, who went home that day, and the teacher who saw them off. These were not reliable witnesses in the legal sense. They were children, their memories, filtered through fear and time, but they were also the last people to see Sarah alive, and their small, fragmented recollections held the key to the town's quiet, simmering obsession. It started with the whispers. The children, now forced into a new normal, began to talk amongst themselves. A few remembered a strange car, not a new one, but an older, beat-up vehicle that had been parked on a side road near the schoolhouse. It was a detail they hadn't thought to mention to the police, because in 1930, a broken-down car was a common sight, but in retrospect, it felt significant. Another student remembered a small argument Sarah had with one of her friends just before the bell rang. It was a petty squabble over a game, but could it have escalated? Could it have been enough to cause Sarah to run off on her own, taking a shortcut she wasn't supposed to? And then there was the teacher, who in her own quiet moments of reflection, remembered a fleeting look on Sarah's face, just as she was leaving a flicker of something that she couldn't quite place. Was it sadness, anxiety, or just the normal, fleeting emotions of a 10-year-old at the end of the day? These small personal recollections weren't leads for a detective, but they were a lifeline for a community desperate for answers. Asterisk, as the months passed, the whispers turned into a kind of unofficial oral history. The children, now slightly older and able to articulate their memories more clearly, began to fill in the gaps for their parents. One girl, a close friend of Sarah's, recalled a story Sarah had told her on the playground just a week before she vanished. Sarah had mentioned a gift she had received from an adult in the community, a beautiful, hand-carved wooden bird. The gift itself seemed innocuous, but the way Sarah had described it, whispering, as if it were a secret, stuck with her friend. She couldn't remember who had given it to her, or why it was a secret, but the memory was now a vivid and unsettling detail. This small piece of information, shared over a dinner table, became a new line of inquiry for the community. The townspeople began to wonder who in their small, close-knit world would give a 10-year-old girl a secret gift. The list of potential suspects, which had officially been cleared, now unofficially grew. The recluse on the edge of the woods was back in the conversation. The quiet man who ran the general store, the kind one who always gave the children a piece of candy, was also considered. The very people who had been the most helpful and kind were now viewed with a new, dark suspicion. Emotional and anecdotal investigation was deeply flawed, driven by fear and grief rather than evidence, but it spoke to the town's desperate need to find a reason, a motive, something to make sense of the senseless. The police had looked for a killer, but the town was looking for a secret, and the more they looked, the more they realized that their seemingly idyllic community had hidden depths, filled with small, unspoken tensions and private lives that no one truly knew. The children's memories, once dismissed as unreliable, were now the only thread they had left to pull. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The whispers weren't just about the children's memories. They were about the adults, too. As the community re-examined the day of the disappearance through the lens of suspicion, they started to notice small, strange details about their neighbors. The man who owned the general store, a seemingly kind figure, had been seen talking to Sarah's parents a few weeks before she vanished. Was it a simple conversation, or was there something more to it? The man himself was a quiet widower who kept to himself, and his solitary nature was now seen as a sign of something to hide. He had an alibi. He was at his store all afternoon, a fact confirmed by a few customers, but in the court of public opinion, an alibi wasn't enough to erase the growing suspicion. Then there was the teacher's husband, a man who worked as a logger and spent his days in the same woods the search party had so meticulously combed. He was a gruff but hard-working man, and he had been a fixture in the community for years. But after the disappearance, his quiet demeanor was reinterpreted as a sign of a troubled soul. Was it possible he had seen something and kept silent? Or worse, was he involved? He was questioned by the sheriff, and while he had no concrete alibi for the exact time Sarah went missing, his wife, the teacher, swore he was home for dinner at the usual time. But the whispers persisted, a slow-spreading poison that made everyone look at each other with a hint of fear and distrust. These were the kinds of conversations that happened behind closed doors, in hushed tones over cups of coffee. They weren't based on facts or evidence, but on the desperate need to find a logical explanation for an illogical event. The town, in its grief, had turned inward and started to devour itself. Every small detail, every quiet conversation, every peculiar habit, was re-examined and given a sinister new meaning. The true witnesses weren't just the children, but the collective memory of the entire town. A memory that was now warped and twisted by the pain of a tragedy that refused to be solved. Asterisk, the collective memory of the town, though fractured and colored by rumor, did produce one compelling and utterly terrifying theory. It was born not from a specific fact, but from the emotional echo of the event itself. Some of the older students, the ones who had been with Sarah on her last day, began to talk about the feeling in the classroom. They spoke of a subtle tension, a feeling of unease that had been present in the last few days before the disappearance. It was something they couldn't articulate, just a vague sense that something was wrong. But could it be more than just a premonition? The theory that emerged from this was chilling. What if Sarah's disappearance wasn't the act of a single person, but a collective one? A terrible secret kept by someone in the class, or even the teacher herself, who had somehow become tangled in a lie. It was a truly dark thought, but it was the only one that seemed to explain the complete lack of evidence. The idea that a group of people, bound by a shared, terrible secret, could have conspired to cover up a crime was too much for the community to bear. They had already turned on each other, but the idea of turning on their own children was a line they couldn't cross. The whispers eventually died down, not because the mystery was solved, but because the town simply ran out of energy to keep chasing ghosts. The memory of Sarah Miller was still there, but it was now a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered to children on their way to school. The children who had been in the classroom that day grew up, carrying with them the burden of a secret they didn't even know they had. They were the witnesses, the last ones to see Sarah smile, and the ones who had to live with the knowledge that one of their friends had vanished, leaving a mystery that no one, not the police, not their parents, and not even time itself, could ever solved. The classroom of 27 students would forever be known as the classroom of 26, a haunting riddle with a human cost. Asterisk decades passed. The small town's roads were paved, new houses were built, and the old one-room schoolhouse was eventually torn down, replaced by a modern, consolidated school. The story of Sarah Miller became less of a recent memory and more of a local ghost story, a piece of unsettling folklore told around campfires. The students who had been in that classroom were now grandparents themselves, their hair gray, their memories of the event hazy and fragmented. The police files, once a source of frantic investigation, were now yellowed, brittle documents buried in an archive. A testament to a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. But in the world of cold cases, forever is a long time. The case was reopened in the late 1980s. A new generation of detectives, armed with new technology and a fresh perspective, took a second look at the file. The initial impetus was an academic project for a cold case unit of practice run on a historical case with a complete lack of evidence. They saw a story that wasn't just about a missing child, but about a community that had completely unraveled under pressure. Their goal wasn't just to find a body or a suspect, but to understand what went wrong with the original investigation. What had the first team missed? They started by digitizing the old police reports, cross-referencing names and dates with a thoroughness that would have been impossible in 1930. They also began to track down the surviving witnesses. The children, who were now old men and women, the teacher, if she was still alive. They knew that human memory can be flawed, but they also knew that time can sometimes unearth details that were too painful or too insignificant to be remembered. At the time of the event, the original investigators had looked for a killer, but this new team was looking for something else entirely, the truth hidden between the lines. The tiny cracks in a story that had been told the same way for 60 years. They were about to learn that the past isn't always gone. Sometimes it's just sleeping, waiting for the right person to wake it up. The new team of detectives, led by a seasoned investigator named David Riley, began their work by revisiting the site of the old schoolhouse. All that remained was a grassy field, but with the aid of old town maps and aerial photos, they were able to pinpoint the exact location where the building had stood. They also located the exact route the children would have taken home. This time, however, they didn't just walk the path. They used ground-penetrating radar, a technology that could see what lay beneath the surface, to scan the area where the first search parties had failed. They were looking for any disturbance in the soil, anything that might suggest a grave or a buried object. While the ground team worked, Riley and his partners began the challenging task of finding and interviewing the surviving classmates. They were all in their late 60s and early 70s now, and their memories of the event were, as expected, a mix of clarity and confusion. Some of them had blocked out the memory almost entirely, a common psychological response to trauma. Others, however, had spent their entire lives thinking about it, and their memories, though old, were razor. One woman, who had been Sarah's best friend, recalled a detail she had never shared with anyone, not even her own children. She remembered a small hand-painted button that had come from Sarah's coat. She had picked it up in the schoolyard the day after Sarah disappeared, and in her fear and confusion, she had simply put it in her pocket and forgotten about it for decades. The button was long gone, but the memory was a critical piece of information. The new team also revisited the infamous confession of Thomas Garrett. They looked at the old interrogation transcripts and noticed something the original team had missed. Garrity's supposed inside knowledge of the school and the town was not, in fact, inside knowledge at all. He had been a worker at a local farm for a few weeks before the disappearance, and he had spent time at the general store where he could have easily overheard conversations about the school and the children. His confession, once seen as a source of truth, was now clearly a desperate bid for attention from a man who had pieced together details from common knowledge. This realization didn't solve the case, but it did a crucial thing. It erased a false lead and brought the investigation back to square one, where the real answers were still waiting to be found. The new team's investigation wasn't just about digging into old files. It was about digging into people's memories and emotions. They went back to the old one-room schoolhouse and, using the old town records, located the names of every student who was in that classroom on that fateful day. They created a modern file for each one, a dossier filled with their life story after the disappearance. This wasn't just to find a suspect. It was to find the story behind the silence. One of the most compelling interviews was with the teacher, now a frail but sharp-witted woman, in a nursing home. She had spent a lifetime feeling the burden of that day, and for the first time, she was speaking to someone who truly understood the gravity of her position. She revealed a small, but crucial detail that she had never shared before. She remembered a note, a small folded piece of paper that was left on her desk after school that day. She had assumed it was from one of the older students, a simple note asking about a homework assignment. She had put it in her pocket and forgotten about it in the panic that followed Sarah's disappearance. By the time she remembered it, it was gone, likely lost in the chaos of the search. She hadn't mentioned it to the original investigators, because, in her grief and confusion, it seemed insignificant. But for the new team, it was a bombshell. A note meant a message meant a plan, and a plan meant that Sarah's disappearance wasn't a spontaneous act. This new piece of evidence, memory of a lost note, changed everything. It moved the case from a random tragedy to a premeditated event. It suggested that someone in that classroom, or someone with access to it, had orchestrated the disappearance. The new investigation wasn't just a cold case anymore, it was a race against time to find a note that had been lost for 60 years, a note that could contain the answer to a question that had haunted a town for generations. The cold case wasn't just heating up, it was boiling over. The new team of detectives, energized by the possibility of the lost note, began to shift their focus. The original investigation had looked for a crime of opportunity, a quick, unplanned act, but the memory of a note pointed to a crime of premeditation, a secret plan that had been put into motion inside the very walls of the schoolhouse. This new theory made the case even more chilling. A note meant a collaboration, a plan. It meant that someone in that small, innocent classroom had been hiding a secret for decades. The investigators returned to the surviving classmates, but this time, their questions were more pointed. They asked not about what they saw on the way home, but about what they saw inside the classroom. They wanted to know about alliances, friendships, and enmities. Who did Sarah talk to? Who did she sit with? Who was she close to? And who might have held a grudge against her? The old men and women, now in the twilight of their lives, had to dig deep into the memories of their 10-year-old selves, a painful and difficult process. One classmate, a boy who had had a crush on Sarah, remembered her receiving a small folded piece of paper from another student, a girl she was friends with. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but now, the memory was a source of great pain and regret. This new information, though still anecdotal, was a huge breakthrough. It placed the note, and therefore the plan, firmly inside the classroom. It meant the key to the mystery wasn't a drifter, a neighbor, or a family secret. The key was in the collective memory of the 26 students who went home that day. The cold case wasn't just hot, it was alive. The investigators now had a new mission, to find out who passed the note, what was written on it, and what happened after Sarah read it. The truth, buried for 60 years, was finally beginning to stir, and it was ready to tell its story. With the cold case now hot, the detectives had a new perspective. They had a motive, a potential note, and a closed-off environment. But even with a lifetime of experience, they couldn't solve a decades-old crime with just fragments of memory. The problem with an investigation like this is that with every answer, a dozen more questions arise. The new team had a suspect, someone from within the schoolhouse. But who, and why? The investigators, now focusing on the memories of a small, folded piece of paper, had to ask the most difficult question of all. Who would have a motive to hurt Sarah Miller? They went back to the original police files, to the notes from the initial interviews with the students. The original sheriff had asked about fights, and the answers were always the same. No one had a fight with Sarah. She was a kind, well-liked girl. But what if the motive wasn't a fight, but something more subtle? Something that a 10-year-old wouldn't even recognize as a motive. The team began to look into the backgrounds of the other students, not for criminal records, but for a different kind of history. They found a girl who had been Sarah's best friend at the time, a girl who, according to her own adult memories, had been jealous of Sarah's artistic talent. Was a child's jealousy enough to orchestrate a disappearance? It seemed unlikely, but in the absence of a better explanation, it became a possibility. They also found a boy who had been the subject of Sarah's attention. He had a small crush on her, and she had, in a way only a 10-year-old could, rejected his advances. Was this enough to turn a harmless crush into a dangerous obsession? These were the kinds of questions that the new team was forced to ask, questions that would have been unthinkable to the original sheriff. As the detectives dug deeper into the lives of the now burly classmates, they uncovered a pattern of inconsistencies and memory lapses. The woman who had been Sarah's best friend, the one who had remembered the small, hand-painted button, also revealed a secret of her own. She had, in a moment of childhood anger, told Sarah that she wished she would just go away. It was a childish insult, the kind said 1,000 times on a playground. But now, with the weight of 60 years of silence and guilt, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that her words had somehow been a part of the terrible chain of events. The detectives also revisited the teacher's memory of the lost note. The original interview hadn't provided enough detail, but the subsequent ones did. The teacher had remembered that the note was folded in a specific, intricate way, a kind of fold she had only ever seen a few times before. It was a detail so specific that it felt like a potential fingerprint. She described the fold to the detectives, and they, in turn, began to ask the surviving classmates about it. They were looking for the one person who could fold a note in that particular, idiosyncratic way. This was a long shot, a desperate attempt to find a link that had been lost to time. The interviews with the now early classmates were a series of painful revelations and fragmented memories. They were all grappling with the same question: what had they missed? What small detail, what fleeting emotion, what overheard word had been the key to the mystery? They had all gone home that day, but they had never truly left the classroom. The cold case had been a ghost in their lives for 60 years, and now, with the renewed interest of the detectives, it had become a living, breathing thing, demanding answers they might not have the strength to give. The new team, armed with the memories of the surviving classmates, began to focus on a particular group of students, a small clique of girls who were close with Sarah. The lost note, according to one of the witnesses, had been passed between them. The detectives realized that the original investigation had been too focused on finding a single culprit, a lone redditor who had taken Sarah from the town. They were now working with a new, and far more sinister, theory, a collective conspiracy of children. The idea was horrifying. Could a group of 10-year-olds have orchestrated a plan to get rid of a friend? And if so, why? The detectives began to look at the social dynamics of the classroom. They interviewed a surviving classmate who, as an adult, was a retired school principal. He provided invaluable insight into the inner world of a one-room schoolhouse. He explained that social hierarchies were everything. A perceived slight, a popular girl's favor, or a simple argument could take on monumental importance. Sarah, being bright and well-liked, was at the top of that hierarchy. The question was, had someone wanted to take her place? This new direction didn't provide any concrete evidence, but it provided a psychological framework for the crime. It suggested that Sarah's disappearance wasn't a random act of violence, but a planned, calculated event born from the complex and often cruel world of childhood social dynamics. The detectives now had a new mission, to find the ringleader of this potential conspiracy. They were searching not for a killer, but for a co-conspirator, person who had, for 60 years, held the town's deepest secret. The case was no longer a mystery about what happened to Sarah, but a mystery about the secret life of a small town. A secret that had been buried in the hearts of a group of children for a lifetime. Despite the new theory and the powerful emotional testimony of the now dirty classmates, the case still had no smoking gun. The detectives had a new perspective, a fresh lead, and a mountain of anecdotal evidence. But they lacked a crucial piece of the puzzle, a body. Without Sarah Miller's remains, they couldn't confirm a murder. Without a murder, they couldn't charge a suspect. The case, despite being hot, was still fundamentally cold. It was a perfect, chilling riddle with a terrible solution, but no proof. Investigation hit a wall. The person who passed the note, and the other members of the clique, all denied any wrongdoing. Their stories, though filled with inconsistencies from their childlike memories, were all the same. They knew nothing about Sarah's disappearance. They were just as confused and heartbroken as the rest of the town. With no physical evidence, no note, and no confession, the detectives were forced to concede that this was a mystery that might never be solved. The silence had held its own for 60 years, and it seemed it would continue to do so. But the new investigation did one thing that the original one couldn't. It brought the community together. The surviving classmates, now in their twilight years, began to talk to each other. They shared their memories, their fears, and their guilt. They realized they had all been carrying the same burden for a lifetime. The investigation didn't give them an answer, but it gave them something almost as important, a sense of shared grief and a space to finally talk about the tragedy that had defined their childhoods. The unanswered questions still hung in the air, but now, they were being asked in a new way, with a new sense of openness and shared pain. The case of the missing schoolgirl was still a mystery, but it was no longer a solitary one. It belonged to the 26 students who went home, and they were finally ready to face it together. A cold case isn't just a file in a dusty archive. It's a wound that never truly heals. The story of Sarah Miller's disappearance wasn't just a mystery. It was a defining event that cast a long, dark shadow over an entire community. The human cost of that day was immeasurable, touching every single person who was a part of that small town, and especially those who were in that one-room schoolhouse. The Miller family, of course, bore the brunt of the tragedy. Their lives were forever shattered. A happy, bustling home became a mausoleum of memory, a place where a child's laughter was replaced by an agonizing silence. They spent their lives in a state of perpetual grief, never knowing what happened to their daughter, unable to give her a proper burial, and unable to find the closure that every grieving family deserves. But the emotional toll didn't stop there. The teacher, who had been the last adult to see Sarah alive, was haunted by the event for the rest of her life. She was a professional who had been proud of her ability to care for and educate her students. But the disappearance of one of them left an indelible mark of failure on her soul. She would often wake up in the middle of the night, replaying the events of that afternoon, searching for a sign, a clue, or a detail she might have missed. She eventually left the town, unable to face the daily reminder of Sarah's empty desk. But she never truly left the classroom in her mind. The children, the 26 students who went home, were also deeply affected. Their innocence was stolen that day. They had to grow up with the knowledge that a monster, real or imagined, was hiding in their town, possibly among their friends. Their childhood memories were now tainted by a dark undercurrent of fear and suspicion. They had to learn, at a very young age, that the world wasn't a safe place, that bad things could happen to good people without any reason. This wasn't just a story they were a part of, it was a scar they would carry for a lifetime. Asterisk the emotional cost of Sarah Miller's disappearance extended far beyond the immediate families and those directly involved. It fundamentally altered the fabric of the community itself. The trust that had once been the bedrock of the small town was shattered. Neighbors began to eye each other with suspicion. The innocent act of a child walking home alone was now replaced by the grim necessity of parents walking their children to and from school, their hands tightly clasped in a silent gesture of fear. The once open doors of the community were now locked. The town, which had once been a single, unified entity, was now a collection of frightened, isolated households. The annual school events, the Christmas pageants, and the end-of-year picnics were never quite the same. The empty chair at the front of the classroom was a constant, unspoken presence, a shadow that fell over every moment of joy and celebration. The school, once a symbol of hope and progress, became a painful reminder of a life cut short, a place where a great loss had occurred. The students who had been in that classroom were forever linked, not by friendship and shared memories, but by a shared trauma. They were the class of 30, but their identity was defined by the tragedy of the one who was missing, not the experiences of the 26 who were there. This pervasive sense of loss and mistrust was a silent epidemic. It was passed down from generation to generation, a grim inheritance. Children who weren't even born when Sarah vanished grew up hearing the whispers and seeing the fear in their parents' eyes. The town's folklore was now a dark one, a cautionary tale that served as a constant reminder of the day the community lost its innocence. This wasn't a story with a neat, happy ending. It was a story of a wound that just kept bleeding, a human cost that continued to accumulate long after the last search party went home. Asterisk the lasting impact of the disappearance was perhaps most evident in the lives of the 26 students who survived. As they grew older, they all carried the event in their own unique way. Some became overprotective parents, unable to shake the memory of a child who had simply vanished. They watched their own children with a hypervigilant intensity, their fear, a constant, invisible companion. Others, in an effort to escape the trauma, left the town and never looked back, severing all ties to a place that held so many painful memories. But no matter how far they ran, the ghost of Sarah Miller followed them. A few of the classmates, however, chose to stay. They were the ones who carried the burden of the town's collective memory, the unofficial historians of the tragedy. They were the ones who would, in their quiet moments, still wonder what had happened. They would look at their own children and grandchildren and see a version of Sarah, a what-if, that was a source of both love and profound sadness. These were the people who, even 60 years later, would still walk past the spot where the old schoolhouse had stood and feel a pang of grief. They were the living legacy of the disappearance, a testament to the idea that some wounds never truly heal. The cold case investigation, decades later, was a double-edged sword. It brought a renewed focus on the tragedy, but it also forced the surviving classmates to relive the most painful day of their lives. It was an opportunity to find closure, but it was also a cruel reopening of a wound that had long been dormant. The interviews and the renewed scrutiny made them confront their own memories and their own small roles in the event. They were asked to remember not just what happened, but what they felt, what they thought, and what they might have done differently. It was a harrowing, emotional process that brought the human cost of the case into sharp relief. Asterisk. Thank you for the permission to continue. Here is the final part of Chapter 9. Chapter 9, The Human Cost, 1500 words, Part 4. The human cost of Sarah Miller's disappearance was the transformation of a small, vibrant community into a place defined by its ghosts. The story wasn't just about a missing girl. It was about the death of innocence, the corrosion of trust, and the deep, abiding pain of the unknown. The town, in a way, was a collective survivor of a crime that had no solution, and the people in it were the living proof that a single tragedy can have an endless ripple effect. The once clear lines between friend and neighbor, between truth and rumor, were forever blurred. The town was left with a permanent shadow on its soul, a shadow that no amount of progress or new buildings could ever erase. The parents of Sarah Miller eventually passed away, their hearts broken by a grief that never found a resting place. The teacher, too, lived out her days with the quiet sorrow of a mystery she felt responsible for. And the 26 students, now elderly and frail, were still bound by the events of that single afternoon. Their lives a testament to the idea that some stories don't have an ending, they just stop. They were all witnesses to a crime that had no name, no perpetrator, and no justice. The cold case investigation, while it didn't solve the mystery, did something profoundly important. It gave the town, and the survivors, a chance to finally talk about the human cost. It allowed them to acknowledge the pain, the guilt, and the fear that had been buried for so long. It showed them that their shared experience wasn't a source of shame, but a source of connection. The human cost was high, but in the end, it was a cost that a generation of people were finally able to face together. The school had students, but it was the 26 who went home who had to live with the ghost of the one who did, and single quotes T.** in the end. What is a legacy? Is it a story with a neat beginning and a decisive end? Or is it a question that echoes through generations? The legacy of Sarah Miller's disappearance isn't a solved case. It's a profound, enduring silence. The mystery of the missing schoolgirl became a part of the very soil of the town, a ghost that lived in the whispering wind that blew through the fields and the creaking of the old farmhouses at night. The official cold case investigation eventually closed, not with a verdict, but with an admission of defeat. The detectives, with all their modern tools and fresh perspectives, had come to the same conclusion as the original sheriff. The evidence wasn't there. The truth, if it ever existed, was buried with time and shrouded in the fragile, flawed memories of a group of children who had grown old. But a legacy is more than just a case file. The legacy of this tragedy was the lasting effect it had on the people who lived through it. The 26 students who went home that day were forever changed. They were forced to confront a reality that no child should ever have to face, that a trusted, safe world could turn dangerous in an instant. They learned to live with a secret that wasn't their own, a silence that they carried in their hearts for their entire lives. They were a testament to the idea that some stories don't have a final chapter, they just have a final, agonizing question. The one-room schoolhouse, the very place where the tragedy began, was eventually dismantled. Its wood was repurposed, its land was reclaimed, and its memory was absorbed into the collective consciousness of the town. But the empty spot where it once stood, a grassy field, now indistinguishable from any other, was always seen differently by the people who remembered. It was a place where 27 children had laughed and learned, but it was also a place where a child had vanished, leaving a void that would never be filled. The schoolhouse was gone, but the silence it left behind was a permanent monument to a mystery that would never be solved. Asterisk, the legacy of Sarah Miller is not a hero's tale or a detective's triumph. It's a quiet reminder that some stories end not with a bang, but with a whisper. The mystery of her disappearance became a shared burden, a secret that the entire town was forced to keep. It was a story of what could happen, a constant source of anxiety that colored the lives of generations. The children who grew up hearing the tale of the empty desk learned to be cautious, to be suspicious of strangers, and to hold their loved ones a little tighter. The town itself, which had once been a symbol of pastoral innocence, was forever marked by a sense of loss and mistrust. The full weight of this legacy, however, fell squarely on the shoulders of the 26 students who went home. They were the last witnesses, the final threads of a story that had no resolution. As they aged, their memories of Sarah were not just of a friend, but of a symbol of the line between safety and danger, between a normal life and a life defined by a question mark. They had to live with the knowledge that one of their own had been taken, and that no amount of searching, questioning, or hoping could ever bring her back or reveal the truth. They were not just the survivors of a tragedy. They were the custodians of its secret, and that, in the end, is the chilling final thought we are left with. 27 students went to a small, remote schoolhouse. For a few hours, they were all together, learning and laughing and living a simple life, but when the final bell rang, only 26 of them ever went home. The mystery of the one who didn't is a story of a town's broken heart, a family's unending grief, and a group of children's lost innocence. It is a story of a silence that will forever speak volumes. A legacy of a ghost who haunts not just a place, but the very memories of a generation. The case may be closed, the files may be dusty, but the question remains. Suspended in the air, a final, chilling whisper in the heart of a small town. What really happened to the 26 who went home?